All right, this is chapter 4, National Security and School Safety. It's in our textbooks on page 101 to 124. It covers the implications of school safety due to Homeland Security, the Patriot Act, No Child Left Behind, and other things. It also addresses the handling of violence in schools, freedom of expression, zero tolerance policies, and metal detectors in the schools. On slide 2, you can see focus really was placed on school safety after the events of September 11th in 2001. On November 26th of 2002, President George W. Bush signed a terrorist alert system into law. Also, the instances of school violence resulting in injuries and deaths of students, faculty, and staff began to increase during those times. These trends drew attention to public schools and what they were doing to ensure that that they were safe places for students to learn, and that they increased the need for school officials to implement measures to address national and local threats to schools. On slide 3, since the events of 9/11, many school districts have collaborated with local law enforcement agencies about safety and policy implications involving safety in order to address the vulnerabilities of public schools to various threats to safety. These collaborations and policy updates have not only been in response to threats of violence, but also to address schools' plans and responses to natural disasters such as hurricanes, tornadoes, and earthquakes. These actions are an attempt for schools to respond proactively rather than reactively. On slide 4, we get into the U.S. Patriot Act. After the events of 9/11, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act that was revised and was called the USA Patriot Act in order to authorize U.S. law authorities to investigate and preempt potential terrorist acts. The Patriot Act defined terrorism as an activity that results in coercion or intimidation involving the government and American citizens, and which includes activities that violate criminal law and endanger human life. Public schools do fall under the jurisdiction of this act and therefore must comply with the following directives. The FBI may obtain a court order without probable cause for the production of any tangible resources for an authorized investigation to protect against terrorism or clandestine intelligence activities. Tangible resources include books, records, paper documents, and things like that. Moving on to slide 5, information relating to internet usage, including email addresses, may also be monitored. And in these investigations, educational agencies and institutions have to disclose FERPA information without the consent or knowledge of student or parent. When this disclosure has occurred, it's also no longer in this case required for a school official to record that disclosure of information from a student's record. All of this has kind of led to a lot of hot debate between Democrats and Republicans about whether this is granting too much power to the FBI and whether it borders on abuse of powers. We've all heard that. It's a discussion of balancing national security against individual rights. And it's interesting that since the Patriot Act has become law, the FBI has issued more than 30,000 investigations per year, which is about 100 times the amount of investigations that they had enacted before the Patriot Act. Regardless of the debate, though, Congress has reauthorized and supported the act. Moving on to slide 6, we get to No Child Left Behind in school safety. This act has also made school safety a major priority for local school districts, specifically regarding plans on file to ensure safe and drug-free learning environments. The National School Safety Center was established by presidential directive in 1984 to provide assistance in combating school safety problems. The NSSC established minimal guidelines in 9 areas pertaining to the roles of schools and homeland security, which can be found on pages 104 and 105 of our textbook in more detail. But schools are able to develop policies that exceed these guidelines, but the minimal guidelines include, number 1, in the school's mission statement, must identify the context for which the school wishes the academic learning to take place, using phrases like to learn in a safe and secure environment free of violence, drugs, and fear. Number 2, identify a specific procedure for evaluating and responding to threats. Number 3, identify the potential disasters that could occur based on the school setting and climate. Number 4, control campus access. Number 5, identify specifically assigned roles and responsibilities. Number 6, identify who to call in a crisis. Number 7, provide cultural awareness and sensitivity training for all members of the school community. Number 8, establish an emergency operation communication system. Number 9, implement a uniform school crime reporting and record keeping system. And so those are like minimum guidelines. Again, the schools themselves can exceed those if they want to. Other guidelines that are included on these pages in our textbook include help schools establish procedures for evaluating and responding to threats and national emergencies, including bomb threats and explosions, intruders or unauthorized visitors, biological, radiological attacks, utility failures, mass transit disasters. And that concludes the first portion.
Okay, and handling violence in schools, which is found on 105 to 110. With the presence of gangs in schools, school leaders are encountering pressures from parents, citizens, and school boards to provide a safe environment where teachers can teach and students can learn. So creating a safe and positive environment in schools so that students feel confident in sharing information that pertains to violence is pivotal to help reduce violence in schools. Teachers and other school personnel are in fact responsible for all students, not just students in which they are assigned. Teaching students alternative ways to resolve conflict, control anger, respecting others can also be effective in reducing violence in schools. Hazing is also another significant problem in schools that can cause major harm, and hazing is referred to the act of humiliating, using abuse and harassment as a way to get individuals to join a group. So something else that all school personnel should be educated on to look for signs of that type of violence. Next slide. Added to these pressures is the view of courts that schools are safe places based on the assumption that children are supervised by licensed and well-trained teachers and administrators. So again, that these school personnel are in fact, trained and understand what to look for and watch for in students. They have a responsibility to create, again, that safe relationships so that all students so that not just students or that all students they're responsible for all students. So school personnel need to be visible in hallways, stairwells, etc. Bullying is also associated with many acts of violence in public schools. So in general, it generally involves intentional, cruel behavior between the person who exhibits this behavior and the same students who are victims of bullying behavior. So school and district policies are formulated to address bullying and are categorized as anti-bullying policies, which is necessary to create a safe school and minimize bullying. It's important for all staff to be aware of signs of violence in schools and consulting with parents when necessary to provide interventions if that is something that needs to take place. A survey by the U.S. Department of Justice, it just stated that the largest percentage of children who reported being bullied within the last year, these instances took place in the hallways and stairwells. And in the next slide, there's often a pattern of repeated antisocial behavior toward others, but bullying may also involve a single incident. A bullying, depending on the circumstances, may be charged criminally if he or she exceeds the age of 12. So students typically know and understand who the bullies are within the school, and they can assist in deterring bullying. This is why it's critical for all students to feel safe with all school teachers, personnel, and staff, so the district can enforce and maintain strong anti-bullying policies to protect all students. It is also important for school staff to understand long-term effects that bullying can have on students. Creating a school environment where talking openly about this issue, listening and encouraging students to share their feelings on student relationships, and creating more supervision can also reduce this issue in schools. And that concludes violence in schools.
Now moving on to cyberbullying, it was from page 111 to 114 inside of our textbook. Cyberbullying has a couple different definitions, but it usually involves the use of electronic devices to post harmful, embarrassing text or images intended to create anxiety, intimidation, or emotional distress in another person. On the next slide, it talks about the more serious forms of communication that may happen with cyberbullying. Those include hate speech, threats, sexually offensive content, or messages designed to ridicule the victim. A consistent pattern of these types of communication on the internet constitutes cyberbullying. On figure 4.4 on page 111 in our text, it indicates that 9% of students aged 12 to 18 reported cyberbullying as a problem. Of that, 6.9% were males and 11.2% of females report those as problems. A really bad case of it led to the Megan Meyer Cyberbullying Prevention Act. Megan Meyer was just 3 weeks away from her 14th birthday when she committed suicide after a case of cyberbullying. Her classmate and her mother fabricated an online account attributed to a 16-year-old boy who she had a crush on. It started off cordial and positive, and then it ended up turning really, really negative and suggesting that she was a bad person. As I said, just 3 weeks before her 14th birthday, she ended up taking her own life. After she did, HR 1966 was introduced into Congress. It is known as the Megan Meyer Cyberbullying Prevention Act. On the next slide, the intent of this act is to amend the federal criminal code to impose criminal penalties on anyone who transmits in interstate or foreign commerce or a communication intended to coerce, intimidate, harass, or cause substantial emotional distress to another person using electronic means to support severe, repeated, and hostile behavior. The bill is still pending in Congress, and it was introduced in 2009. There was another bill that is only for Florida called the Jeffrey Johnston Stand Up for All Students Act. He took his own life in 2008, and that law passed pretty much immediately inside of Florida. It requires all school districts to institute anti-bullying policies that specifically ban harassment and intimidation, create a diligent reporting procedure, require prompt investigation of allegations, and outline consequences for students and school employees who violate the policy. Bullies also must be referred to counseling, and the proper authorities and the victims' families must be notified regarding what has been done to protect their child. And that is actually it on cyberbullying.
Okay, and then the last two sections, well, three sections are gangs, zero tolerance, and metal detectors. So gang activity decreased from the mid 1990s to 2005, but since then it is slowly increasing. It is the responsibility of the school to ensure that no one is harmed because of violent acts or situations. And leaders in the school should monitor gang activity and respond quickly before the activity is escalated or there is friction between gangs. So characteristics and the membership. So gangs are best described as groups of individuals involved in unusually close social relationships. They share a common collective identity expressed through a gang name, and they adopt certain symbols or signs to claim control over certain turf or territory. Other criminal activity goes along with it. Drugs, weapon trafficking. They do that to create fear among others. That goes into the roles of the chain of command and how they highly respect others that are in high command. And then members can be as young as 8 or 9, and more females are joining throughout the years. Gang dress. So each member or different gangs tend to wear specific apparel or colors to convey their gang affiliation. where gang activity has prevailed in the school or community, and there is clear knowledge that certain types of dress are associated with disruptive gang activity, school officials may prohibit such that dress. Gangs are starting to wear clothes that are less recognizable to law enforcement, school personnel, and parents. The duty of care and violence. So based on school personnel are expected to exercise a standard of care that any other reasonable professional will exercise under the circumstances. So creating that school safety plan, making sure it's in place in case something would arise. Follow through needs to be done on threats to gang members. So if you say you're going to do something in that policy or that school plan, it needs to be done. Classroom discussions and lessons that include gang issues, and then process put in place to mediate conflicts between rival gangs throughout the school year, just to make sure things don't happen in the school. Moving on to school uniform and freedom of expression and school safety. In a desire to create and maintain safe schools, officials have put in dress codes. A lot of, if it doesn't have a dress code, then other ones will go to uniform dress. For uniform dress, it's important to be mindful of the students and the families in your districts. So involve parents in making those policies to make sure that you are preserving students' religious rights, their cultural rights. Thinking about financial issues to make sure that if parents don't have the means to put their students in uniforms, there's something in place so that the school can either give assistance or there's assistance somewhere. Enforce the uniform policy for everyone, make sure it's consistent and fair, and be flexible and revise uniform policy if that arises. For the drug testing and the alcohol slides, that goes into the zero tolerance. So zero tolerance began in 1990 for students that brought weapons, drugs, alcohol to school, and it was a one strike, you're out policy. Gun-Free School Act of 1994 by President Bill Clinton mandated expulsion if a weapon was brought to school. Zero tolerance often ignores protected rights because it is an automatic guilty sentence. Past behavior is not always considered or seriousness of the offense, and students aren't always able to explain their side. Due process is the presumption of guilt conflicts with the student's due right process rights. So there is much controversy over recent zero policy practices because, again, it's one and you're done. There's no chance for the student to talk or explain what had happened. So the five situations are summarized that have raised questions about the legalities of these decisions. President Obama's administration has encouraged schools to abandon overzealous discipline policies that result in students going to court rather than the principal's office. So kind of that zero tolerance of it's one and you're done. 7 guidelines that were provided in the book for zero tolerance for administrators. Do not use it to get rid of disruptive students. Involve other parties in the formulation of zero tolerance policies. Draft policies that recognize the constitutional right. Do not assume zero tolerance is a cure-all for student misconduct. Seek alternative educational opportunities when a student is expelled for an extended period of time. So if there's an alternative program in the school, making sure that we're still providing academic needs for that student. Consider the following before determining punishment. What is the history of the behavior, the seriousness of the offense, and the immediate need to act? And then address the student's substantial and procedural process rights in all disciplinary matters. And then there were no slides on metal detectors, but I'm going to hit on those real quick since they are in the slides. So there have been no cases brought between the Supreme Court regarding metal detectors. 4 cases were presented in this section. 3 of them found that the use of metal detectors and decisions were justified and upheld. The 5 guidelines that were provided for administrators when making decisions involving metal detectors were: metal detectors should be used when there's evidence that a student possesses a threat to the health and safety of the school, and students and parents should be informed before they are employed. Courts will support the use if they are used to achieve a legitimate school interest. Students and parents would be informed through a legal defensible school policy regarding the use of metal detectors. So just making sure there's no surprise. So make sure it's in the handbook, make sure that parents know that, hey, we added this new policy, we added this new section in the handbook that we are using metal detectors if we have evidence or suspicion. Students and parents should not be surprised by the use of metal detectors except in unusual circumstances. Again, they'll know by the handbook, and that they need to be told right away that metal detectors were used on their child and not wait until the child gets home to tell them, and then they have to call the school to get an explanation on that. If school officials' acts are reasonable, there will generally be minimal resistance from the parents.